Hello there, everyone. Welcome to today's INEE webinar. Today's focus is catching up on lost learning, applying accelerated approaches in response to COVID-19. We are on the hour, so let's get started and others can join us as we go along. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules, Sarah, if we could go back to the last slide. Thank you. Just a reminder that your participant audio and video are disabled, so don't worry, you won't accidentally come on screen or come off mute due to the high number of participants. This helps keep things smooth. You can also post questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A function there. Please do share your questions with us. We will have 30 minutes of discussion at the end of the webinar, and we'd love to hear your questions so that our panelists can respond to them. There is also a chat function, as you'll see on the right of your screen. Please use that more for maybe questions around the technology or comments or sharing resources, but please share your questions for our panelists using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Also a reminder that the session is being recorded, and today for the first time we're also streaming the webinar using Facebook Live, so welcome to those of you joining on Facebook as well. Closed captioning is also available. Again, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a closed caption option. So if you'd like the closed captions in English, please do click that now. And lastly, just a reminder that the recording and presentations will be shared on the INEE website very soon. And you can, of course, share those widely with your colleagues who may also find this useful. But welcome today. My name is Charlotte Bergen from the INEE Secretariat, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. This webinar forms part of a wider series we're hosting here at INEE focusing on COVID-19 and education in emergencies. Just a reminder that you can find recordings of previous webinars which had covered topics such as teacher support, inclusive education, distance education. You can find all of those on the website, along with a COVID-19 resource collection, technical guidance, policy papers, and other helpful resources during this time. But the webinars are really a space for us to come together as an EIE community to share the challenges we're facing and also to share useful tools, resources, strategies, and learn from one another in these complex times. I would normally hand over now to our director, Dean Brooks. He isn't able to join us this morning. He sends his apologies, but he did want me to say and just to recognise that we are now several months into this unprecedented situation with the global pandemic. And we just wanted to really recognise the incredible commitment and dedication of education colleagues at this time. And we really hope everyone is keeping as safe and well as possible in these complicated times. So thanks everybody. But today we're really excited to be focusing on such an important topic to so many of our members, and we're really excited to be doing that in collaboration with our colleagues at the Accelerated Education Working Group. So huge thanks to them for their collaboration and for the webinar today. The topic is catching up on lost learning and applying accelerated approaches in response to COVID-19. And we know this is a topic that everybody is grappling with at the moment. Although the context is very different in different countries and some schools are opening and other places they are closed indefinitely, everybody is working out and grappling with this question about how to catch up on the learning that has been lost. But at the same time, we're really conscious that in many education in emergencies contexts, there are already a lot of lessons of how to do this in other situations and other emergency responses. So today's really an opportunity to also learn lessons and build on those foundations. Today, I'm really excited that with the agenda we have. Sarah, if we could just share the agenda. We're going to begin by hearing from Martha Hewison, who's an education advisor at UNHCR, but also chairs the Accelerated Education Working Group. And we'll also be hearing from Kayla, who will an independent consultant who's been doing a lot of work and a real technical specialist in this area. And Kayla will be giving us some real insight into a new guidance from the Accelerated Education Working Group. And Martha and Kayla will be sharing with us a COVID-19 decision tree and accompanying brief called COVID-19 Pathways for Return to Learning. And this will really help us look at programme options and considerations for learners who have missed out on education due to the pandemic. It will focus on the return to learning and all the different pathways and considerations that need to be thought about when deciding which programmes are appropriate for which learners, which of course involves so many different factors. And they'll also try to help education stakeholders to look at these options and figure out what is most appropriate in their context. So really grateful, Martha and Kayla, thank you so much for being here to share these with us. We'll then be excited to turn over to our colleagues from Mozambique and Liberia to share some field examples of how they've been putting this into practice in their own contexts. So we'll be hearing from Rafael Bernardo and Nassima Figdia from Mozambique, and then Abba Kanga and Caitlin Saldana from Liberia. I do hope I'm pronouncing your names properly. And then we'll conclude with a moderated discussion, a Q&A, where we hope to hear from as many of you, our attendees, as possible. But I'll stop there because I want to give as much time as possible to our panelists today to really talk about practical work to do this at this time. So I'm going to hand over to Martha for an overview and framing of this important topic. Thank you so much, Martha.
Great, thanks so much, Charlotte, and welcome everybody. Just very, very briefly, I wanted to look at this taxonomy here, and the INEE Alternative Education Workstream have recently developed this taxonomy for formal and non-formal education. And if you look at this taxonomy, you can see in the top purple box, we have formal education, and then in the blue boxes below, we have transitional programs, alternative education programs, and non-certified, non-formal education programs, which all make up part of this non-formal component of non-formal education. If we quickly look at these three different categories within the non-formal sector, we can see that there's transitional programs. Transitional programs are short-term educational programs that really help learners transition into formal education or into alternative education. But transitional programs themselves do not lead to certification. They rather more help learners transition into certified programs. Then we have this category, alternative education. Alternative education is a planned structured education programming for out-of-school children and youth. And alternative education leads to equivalent certified competencies in academic or technical vocational subjects, such as accelerated education or technical vocational TVET programs. And then lastly, at the bottom, we have this non-certified, non-formal education programs, which is education programming for young people who are out of school and does not lead to equivalent certified competencies. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see this orange box with support services. And this support services includes all the programs represented to students, both in formal education and in the non-formal education sector. And the support services covers things like after-school programs or integrated into the curriculum in formal education, remedial education, or after-school support or tutoring. So the reason I wanted to show you this is today in this webinar, we're going to use this taxonomy to really look at the various pathways in both formal and non-formal education that can support learners in helping them return to learning and catch up with their education missed due to the COVID pandemic. Can I have the next slide, please? So how can these learners catch up? What can we do? I think we're all really familiar with the statistics and the figures around the numbers of children and youth who are estimated to be out of school. At the end of April, 1.6 billion learners were estimated to be out of education, with 258 million children who were also out of school before COVID. And we know from previous crises that the longer children and youth are out of school, the less likely they are to return. It's estimated that 9.7 million children may never return to school. So as education systems start to reopen and we try and grapple with all the options to support learners to return, what are the appropriate options and the different pathways for learners from these various programs, for learners who are already in formal education and learners who are in non-formal education in these different categories? And how can we help them catch up and get back on track? Next slide, please. So the Accelerated Education Working Group is a working group made up of education partners working in accelerated education. It's led by UNHCR, and you can see the other members in the AEWG below. And in 2021, we have 4 areas of focus. But in addition, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Accelerated Education Working Group also developed some tools to support ministries of education and key education stakeholders in looking at choices in responding to the needs of learners who have missed out on their education. Next slide, please. So the Accelerated Education Working Group have developed these 3 key pieces of work, and today we're going to look at 2 of them, and then at the end of August we're going to have an additional webinar to look at the 3rd one. So the 3 tools that we've developed this COVID-19 decision tree, which is an adaptation of the Accelerated Education Working Group decision tree that some of you might be familiar with. We've also developed a brief, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, called Pathways for the Return to Learning. And this brief accompanies the decision tree. And then the picture at the bottom, the screenshot at the bottom of the slide, is guidance for practitioners on condensing a curriculum. And this is exactly what it says. It's guidance, very basic guidance, a short document, very practical on how do you go about condensing a curriculum. And we'll be presenting that as an additional 3rd tool in a webinar in the last week of August. So today we're going to focus on the top 2, the decision tree and the brief. And we're really going to look at these learners, as I said, in non-formal education and formal education, and look at the options and considerations in order to catch up on education missed due to the pandemic. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleague who has been really working on the tools with us to present both of these new tools. Thanks, Kayla.
Great, thanks, Martha. And I'm trying to share my screen, but I need Sarah to stop screen sharing. Great, thanks. Let me try again. Perfect. I think I've got it. All right. Are we all set there? All right, great. So thanks again, Martha. All right, so as Martha introduced this taxonomy, which was developed by the INEE's Alternative Education Workstream, we really feel that this taxonomy can help us to think about those children and youth who were previously attending education or who were not previously attending education, who are no longer attending education in person due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we really want to start with thinking about the many groups of children and youth within this taxonomy and outside of it, in thinking about what types of responses might be most appropriate to help learners come back, to catch up, and to get back on track. So first we have those learners who were attending pre-primary, primary, secondary, or higher education in the formal education system. We have those learners who were attending an alternative education program that might have included alternative basic education, accelerated education, skills-based training, all of those full programs that lead to a certification but that lie outside of the formal system. And we also have those who are in non-certified, non-formal education, such as short-term or temporary ad hoc programs, often implemented as sort of a quick response in a refugee context. And then, of course, we can't forget that we also have many, many learners who were out of school prior to the pandemic, were not attending any of those types of programs. And thinking about these learners at this particular time, we really have an opportunity to engage with the different ways that we're going to be offering education in the coming months and years to re-engage those learners or engage them for the first time. So as Martha mentioned, the Accelerated Education Working Group built on its early definitions and decision tree, as well as INEE's taxonomy for non-formal education for out-of-school children and youth, and developed a decision tree and a brief to help education planners, such as ministries, implementers, and donors, to ask critical questions as they plan for the return to learning during COVID-19. So decisions for the return to learning are really going to require thinking about what learners were doing prior to COVID-19, whether they'll be able to return to that particular education program or not, how long they were out of school and the amount of education that was missed, considering various factors, and what barriers they might face in returning to learning. And several response options might be relevant to the COVID-19 response, and each of these requires both a supportive policy and financing environment. And those might include things like extending instructional time, for example, by shortening school breaks or holidays, by extending the school day or the week, or by leveraging distance learning. And I'm sure there's a lot more options out there that are being innovated, that are being attempted and implemented at this time. It might also include implementing catch-up programs, and those are short-term transitional education programs for children and youth who were previously attending school prior to an education disruption. And the catch-up program helps them to learn content that was missed due to the disruption in order to get back on track and return to their education. Third, remedial programs might also be useful, and those are additional targeted support concurrent with regular classes for students who require short-term content or skill support to succeed in regular education programming. And finally, accelerated education programs might be a response, particularly for overage out-of-school children and youth who were out of school prior to the pandemic or who dropped out due to the pandemic. And those programs are flexible, age-appropriate programs run in an accelerated time frame. And it helps, as I mentioned, it helps those overage out-of-school children and youth to obtain a primary education certificate and transition back into formal secondary schools. And I know that was a quick run through of several options, but I'll speak a little bit more about each of these and which is most appropriate to meet the needs of these different learners as we really work through the decision tree. But to work through the decision tree, I'd first like to have you think about learners that you work with or learners that your program works with. And if there are, if there are a lot of different groups of learners, just think of one right now. Pick one group of learners and we'll work through each of these groups separately. So first, let's ask ourselves, what were these learners that we're thinking about doing prior to COVID-19? And some options might be that they were attending formal education, that they were attending a certified alternative education program, which might include a skills training program, or they might be out of school. And we've included in that category those attending a non-certified, non-formal education program. And to follow on to that, if they were attending an alternative education program, what type? Was it an accelerated education program or was it non-accelerated, such as alternative basic education or skills training that is not accelerated? So take a moment just to think about that. So we're first going to start with those learners who are attending either formal education or a non-accelerated alternative education program. And we'll come back to those learners that you work with who are in accelerated education or those who were out of school. So let's ask ourselves, will those same learners in this white box here, will they be able to return to the same program? So we need to consider that some learners in that group will return and some learners will not be able to return. And there are many factors that are particular to individuals, to families, to schools, to communities that might prevent or promote learners to return. So for example, children who are already over age for their grade might be less likely to return to school than their of age peers. And likewise, children in poorer households may be less likely to return than peers in wealthier households. So for those learners who are able to return, we must then ask ourselves, how much education have they missed? And this will need to consider both how long schools were closed and access and quality to distance learning while schools were closed. And it's important to note that what is considered a lot or a little of education missed, which are the two options you'll see here, that's very subjective. So that needs to be decided at the local level. We can't just say if you miss 2 weeks, if you miss 2 months, if you miss 8 months, then you need a certain type of program. It's really context dependent, it's really subjective. So in some situations, missing a couple weeks might mean missing just a little bit of school, and learners can easily be caught up. But in other contexts, a couple weeks might be considered missing quite a lot. So focusing on those learners who we decide have missed just a little bit of education. If those learners were attending formal education or certified alternative education, have missed to be just a little bit of education time, and that might be that schools were only closed for a couple of weeks because then they went on break and they were reopened after the summer break or the holiday. And if it's just a couple of weeks, then maybe that's just a little time. So they could return to that same formal or alternative education program. And then that program or those schools can extend instructional time by extending the school day, shortening breaks, using double shifting, or leveraging distance learning. However, for those learners who we determine have missed quite a lot of time, and again, this is very subjective, if they can return to that same formal or alternative education program, they might need a full catch-up program. And a full catch-up program comes with a condensed curriculum or requires developing a condensed curriculum and implementing that in order to help learners catch up on what they've missed and get back on track. And also just a little plug here, remember that as Martha said, the AEWG is just about to publish some really helpful guidance on how to condense a curriculum in the COVID-19 response. So keep an eye out for the coming release and part 2 of this webinar. So if we're implementing a catch-up program, and that's accelerating learners' process or progress through the curriculum, we might also need to support those learners with remedial education program. And that might be for those learners who are struggling in certain content or in certain skill sets. And finally, just keep in mind that in many countries, it's already being seen, and it will likely to be necessary in most countries, that we'll need to figure out ways to reduce class size in order to adhere to physical distancing. For example, in the United States, this is already being explored, how we can divide classes in half and have one cohort attend on Monday and Tuesday, and the other cohort attend on Thursday and Friday, with a day in between for sanitization. Or we might go see half of the learners go back one week and the other half the next week, and they switch off every other week. And however that looks, whether it be one of those options or a completely different option, that's going to result in learners being in person, in class, fewer hours than usual. So they'll continue to miss education time as we return to learning. So even if learners have only missed a small amount of education when we start to go back, they might continue to miss education time due to adjustments required in order to adhere to physical distancing. And if that's the case, you might still consider implementing a catch-up program with a condensed curriculum anyway. Now, finally, let's go back to those learners who could not return to formal or alternative education. So for those learners, in other words, they drop out due to COVID-19, they might need some sort of non-formal catch-up program. Those who were previously in formal education, they might need a non-formal option. And that program can also provide remedial education for learners who are struggling. But the purpose of the non-formal catch-up program for those who were previously in formal schools is to help them transition quickly back into the formal education, so they don't drop out entirely or end up entirely in the alternative education system. And for those who were in alternative education, such as an alternative basic education program or skills training, if they cannot return due to COVID-19, we can now consider them out of school. And just as Martha mentioned earlier, the AEWG has developed its original decision tree several years ago, and that helps us to make decisions about how to help learners who are out of school, depending on the major barriers that they face. And I just wanted to quickly show you the link and the original decision tree. I don't know if it's possible for somebody at INEE to drop the link in to the chat box, but that way folks can go directly to the decision tree after the presentation if they want the original decision tree as well. Okay, so we've gone down this left side of the decision tree looking at those who are attending formal education and those who are attending a non-accelerated alternative education. But let's go back and ask about what about those learners who were already in an accelerated education program before COVID-19? So this gets a little bit complicated, right? So remember, these programs are for over-age, out-of-school children and youth, and it accelerates the primary or basic curriculum to help them obtain a certificate and get back on track with their peers in order to transition into secondary school. For those learners who were attending AEP, we can still ask ourselves, will they be able to return to the same program? And again, some learners will, and some will face barriers that prevent them from learning. If the answer is yes, that they can go back to AEP, then they should be returned to the same program. However, the part that gets a little tricky is that it's extremely difficult to accelerate an already accelerated program. So helping these learners get back on track is going to require some creativity. It might be possible only by extending instructional time, like shortening breaks or extending the school day. Leveraging distance learning is a potentially really important option. Of course, we need to keep in mind inequities in terms of access to technologies that are used for distance learning, but it could be a good possibility. And of course, it's essential to remember that AEP learners really need to be able to stay on the same academic calendar as the formal schools. And this is to enable them to sit for examinations and transition back into the formal education system. So finding ways to help AE learners stay on track and get back on track is an absolutely essential task, even though it's quite difficult. And then finally, of course, if they cannot return to the AEP due to a number of barriers that they faced prior to COVID-19, which compelled them to be in AEP in the first place, or for new barriers created by COVID-19, we would consider them again out of school, and we can refer back to the AEWG original decision tree. And finally, let's return to thinking about those learners in the far right column who were out of school prior to COVID-19. So it might seem easy to focus only on those learners who were previously attending formal or alternative education before COVID-19, because we already know that the burden to help these learners return is enormous. It already is enormous, and it's going to continue to be incredibly difficult. However, given the global focus on access to high quality education right now, we're exploring all the ways that we can reach all learners, engage them in education. We're giving massive efforts to rapidly develop and scale up innovative models and responses in distance learning and alternative pathways. This pandemic, because of all of that effort, is really an opportune time to focus on those learners who, for reasons of poverty, crisis and conflict, other forms of marginalization, had previously dropped out of school or never began their education, or for those who were forced out of school due to COVID-19. And I think Martha cited a really important statistic here. I think if I understood what you were referencing, that 9.7 million children and youth are predicted to never return after COVID-19. And those are just on top of the 258 million children and youth who were out of school prior to COVID-19. So this is really an important time to focus on increasing access to education for all learners, not just those who were in school prior to the pandemic. So a variety of education programs can benefit those learners, from non-formal catch-up programs to alternative education or accelerated education or skills training, and various innovations in alternative pathways and distance learning. So we can certainly refer to the AEWG decision tree, the original one, but it's essential to remember that many of the barriers that out-of-school children and youth have previously faced in accessing education have been exacerbated by COVID-19. So in addressing these barriers, we need to be sure to explore the nuanced ways that the pandemic has particularly affected girls and boys differently, learners with and without disabilities, learners in rural and urban areas have been affected differently, those that are displaced. And we need to look at all aspects of their life, from the health effects to the economic impacts to the social emotional well-being, and to, of course, learning loss and academic effects. And what is essential to remember is that COVID-19 is a time in which we all have the responsibility and the opportunity to guarantee this right to education for all learners. For those learners who were out of school prior to the pandemic, it's going to be very important, but for all learners as well, back to school campaigns will be essential to really disseminate needed information about the timing and processes of returning to school, as well as providing needed material support. And finally, to round off the decision tree, continuing to leverage the innovations in distance learning that are already being developed and scaled up will be essential in helping learners recover lost learning time, or for remediating learning for those who are struggling, or for ensuring access to those who are unable to return to in-person learning for a variety of reasons. And that, of course, requires considering the equity issues of access to the technologies that are used. Now, we've just talked about several different types of education programs that might be useful in the COVID-19 response, but looking back at the INEE taxonomy, let's think about where they might fit. So extending instructional time can be done really in any type of education program, both formal and non-formal. Catch-up programs too can be implemented in formal and non-formal spaces. That might be, for example, a national catch-up program, as we saw in response to the Ebola virus outbreak in West Africa in 2014-2015. It might also involve catch-up programs in alternative education spaces. And they can also be considered a transitional program, for example, when learners drop out of formal education due to COVID-19, but then participate in a non-formal catch-up program with the goal of transitioning back to formal education. Remedial education is a support service implemented concurrently with classes, which can be implemented in the formal or non-formal spaces. And accelerated education falls squarely within the certified alternative education option to help learners gain a primary certificate and transition to secondary. So, the final point is that in the COVID-19 response, distance learning, again, can be implemented in conjunction with any type of program and can be a core part of the curriculum by supporting in-person instruction, or could be used for remediation for struggling learners. So as you can see, the options for the COVID-19 response are plentiful, both in formal and non-formal spaces, but we know that implementing these options will require significant adaptations to existing systems. And while we explore these options, developing new innovations in alternative pathways both within and outside of the formal education system, and as we scale up distance learning efforts, it's really essential to plan for long-term uptake of these efforts. The time and expertise and investments that we make now to the COVID-19 pandemic will help to build education systems that not only respond to the pandemic now, but that are more resilient and better able to handle future shocks and stresses in the future, whether they be future waves of COVID-19 or other emergencies. So I'll just wrap up here by leaving the link for the tools that I just presented. Both of these tools can help you to think about possible scenarios and possible response options to meet the varied needs of all of the young people in your various contexts. But if there's one thing that we do really know about COVID-19 and the education response is that there is no prescriptive right way to return to learning. So as Charlotte mentioned, as we were opening, we're all figuring this out together to ensure that the return to learning is safe, that it's equitable, and that it contributes to more resilient education systems. Thank you very much. And with that, I will pass it over to my colleagues from Mozambique.
Thanks, Kayla, and welcome to our colleagues from Mozambique. So I'm proud to introduce Rafael Bernardo, the Deputy Director, the National Institute for Education, the Ministry for Education in Mozambique. And we're also joined by Nasima Fijia, the Education Technical Specialist from Save the Children in Mozambique. So thank you both so much for joining us and sharing a really practical example of some of the things that Kayla and Martha have been sharing with us today. Over to you. Let's just check your mic. We're still on mute. Let me see if I can unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Yes. Welcome to Mozambique. My name is Rafael Bernardo. I am with Helena here on my left side. And I am the Deputy Director of National Institute for Educational Development in Mozambique. Next slide, please. I would like to give a small background about education in Mozambique. We have compulsory education from grade 1 up to grade 9. It's a new law which has been approved in 2018, no?
Yeah.
Yeah. So from age 6 to age 12, it is compulsory. We have pre-primary education with 3 years, or from age of 3, but it covers only 4% of population. It's not compulsory, so many people are not attending this pre-primary education. We have then primary education from age of 6. More than 90% of students are attending this primary education. So the rate of enrollment is about the 90%. We have a secondary education where these children who started at age of 6 in the primary schools, only 20% can go to secondary. Only 20% of children can attend secondary education, lower secondary. And to upper secondary, only 8% go there. So our system is very, very selective. We have many students at the beginning, but at the end we have very, very few students. We don't run non-formal education as Ministry of Education. Non-formal education is run by private institutions. But we have some challenges related to war. We have war in Cabo Delgado province, and in the central part of Mozambique, in Manica and Sofala, where we have so many displaced children who need a special kind of support. But to add to this, in whole country, we have more than 12% of orphans. More than 12% of children are orphans. Next slide, please. In order to give a response to this pandemic, the government of Mozambique decided to shut the schools, shut the school from 23 March, and we're planning to open today. Today is it?
So today is 28.
Yeah, we're planning to open yesterday, but because the conditions are not good in the schools, the government decided to reopen the schools up to 15th July, or August. We're going to August now. And Schools are busy now preparing conditions of sanitations, providing water, and dividing classes into small groups
20.
of 20 students each class. We have other work related to
Distance learning.
this distance learning. During this period, we are providing distance learning through radio and TV, but these services are reaching only people in the urban areas. People from rural areas is very difficult to reach them because sometimes they don't have electricity, they don't have radio, they don't have television. So we ask schools to prepare handouts to give these children, and sometimes there's a problem because some schools are very, very poor that cannot they not print these materials. So when we restart the schooling, we need to make sure that we catch up these people or this material we couldn't teach. But teachers are not complaining when we extend the learning time or the teaching time. They're not complaining because they are still paid by the government. Next slide, please. So our school year is of 38 weeks, and we had only 7 weeks before we closed the schools. Now we need to catch up at least 24 weeks until the end of school year. So, but to do this, we need to consider social distancing. So I said before, we have to reduce the classes to small groups of 20, and teachers must be prepared to work with these 3 shifts and to cover this number of children. Yes. Next slide, please. We were, as a way to prepare the returning to school, we're going to we were going to face this returning. The first group to go to school is the grade 12 and teacher training, because we need teachers, and this of grade 12, they must finish the schooling and go. And go. So sometimes this distancing, the social distancing, this social distancing is very difficult. For the first phase, because we have few students of grade 12 in teacher training, will be easier to make this distancing. But when we go to other lower classes or our lower grades, we will face many difficulties to distance. So we are considering to build new classrooms using tents, at least, using tents, and we try to reduce the holidays. No, not holidays. breaks in teaching. So if we start now in August, we will have a small break during the Christmas and the New Year. After that, we resume the classes until February. So the examinations will be on February. That means we can recover these 24 weeks that I mentioned yesterday. Yes. And we are working with the curriculum. We condense the curriculum. We take the curriculum and see which content is not important, or learners can learn again in another place or in another class or grade. So we reduce the amount of content in each grade so that they can cover all the important contents before they end the year. Next, please. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think Nassima, were you going to add a couple of reflections from Save the Children?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Bernardo, to come together and sharing what the MINED is doing to make sure that our children can continue to learn regarding the condition that we have. Let me say that in Mozambique, Minister of Education, can we go to the next slide, please? Oh, I think it's just, we are working with Minister of Education since Save Chile is in 1987. We started in one province in Gaza province, and we established a memorandum with Minister of Education, and all of our program, our projects coming to improve our education in terms of quality, in terms of management system, in terms of tools, and Save the Children is coming with a lot of quality in terms of tools. As you know, we have common approaches that we are using for teacher training program, that we are using for materials, improving materials, or producing material regarding the local resources. And of course, in terms of how better you can involve parents on the learning process. Literacy Boost, this is one of the common approach that we are using, and we shared it with the Minister of Education. And now we could, Minister of Education could produce the National Action Plan to promote literacy in our country, in all schools, particularly in primary schools. And we have also other common approach in terms of protection, in terms of numeracy, in terms of ECD program. This is our big, a good, solid materials or approach that we are using in all of our education program. And we are sharing our advocacy to the MINED is based on evidence. We are bringing from the community level, from the field, from the school level, from the teacher training program, some impact examples, lesson learned, good practices, and we are sharing with the MINED, and we are working very closely with them, and they really appreciated Save the Children work in Mozambique. And we are influencing some key aspects in terms of management, school monitoring, visits monitoring. We are use QLF tools and QLU also. This is what I would like to share with you, that we are very happy, and the Save the Children is recognized from MINED as an agency that coming with a clear support in terms of quality, in terms of approach to improve quality education in Mozambique. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our colleagues in Mozambique for sharing this example. We're now going to hear another practical example of what this can look like, and this time from Liberia. So really thinking about this catching up on lost learning. I'm going to hand over in the first instance to Caitlin and also her colleague, Abba. Thank you both for joining us today. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Charlotte. And thanks so much to the AEWG and INEE for hosting today's webinar. My name is Caitlin Saldana, and I'm joined by my colleague, Abba Karanga. We're excited to share with you a bit about the Luminos Fund and our considerations and plans for the return to learning in Liberia. Next slide. Before we dive in, just a bit of background on Luminos and the Second Chance program. Luminos is a global organization dedicated to ensuring that no child is denied the chance to learn. The Luminos Second Chance program is an accelerated learning program supporting out-of-school children to achieve functional literacy in 10 months. The Second Chance school day is 8 hours long, 5 hours are dedicated to literacy, and 2 hours to numeracy. Upon completion of the program, students transition into the formal school system, usually at grade 3. External evaluation results show that Second Chance students have higher academic outcomes and complete primary school at nearly twice the rate as their peers. Second Chance instills confidence in students' ability to learn, unlocking a lifetime of learning beyond Second Chance. To date, Luminos has supported 136,000 children across Ethiopia, Lebanon, and Liberia with Second Chance education. I'm going to now hand over to Abba, who will share an overview of the context in Liberia and a bit about our COVID response work. Over to you, Abba.
Oh, Abba, you're still on mute. Let me see if I can unmute you.
Hey,
there we
sorry.
go, Abba. That's okay. If you start from the beginning, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and thank you to the organizers for having us on this very important panel. Liberia had barely recovered from 14 years of civil war when we were hit with the Ebola crisis. Barely recovering from Ebola, now we're hit with COVID-19 along with the rest of the world. The effect on education in Liberia from the three crises are very, very similar. With already staggering numbers of out-of-school and overage children, the entire school population has once again been thrown out of school due to the COVID-19, of course. The biggest challenge for educational actors and authorities, including Luminos Fund, is the question of how kids are going to continue education at home. We learned that from the Ebola crisis, a good percentage of students didn't return to school due to a lot of reasons, including the fact that most of our students were direct victims of the crisis. So with the Luminos Fund COVID-19 response, our objectives were clearly to keep children safe during this time, and as well as update them with school work at home. To keep students updated with lessons, we created customized worksheets with daily lessons delivered to them at their home by their facilitators, who are the teachers. These worksheets were strategically designed to be as comprehensive and as fun as possible to ensure that students themselves are able to attend them, because we are very aware of the fact that a lot of the parents that we work with in the communities are illiterate and unable to help these children at home. With this knowledge, we are grateful for the bulk of our facilitators who are still in the communities and are able to provide support to these kids, to kids who were needed in the communities. Facilitators go to these homes, observing all of the safety measures provided by the Ministry of Health. Of course, the wearing of masks, the social distancing, and of course the no touch policy. We've made that a big priority. And to also help our children to stay at home and to be safe, we kind of went a little further with our COVID-19 response by providing food and wash materials for each of our students at their homes. Rice being a staple food, we provide 1 bag of rice to each of these kids, and we are expecting this 1 bag of rice to feed 5 to 6 family, a family of 5 to 6 for about 20 days. This intervention has proven to be very helpful with wonderful feedback from facilitators, supervisors, the community and local ministries, officials. We are confident that our learners will return in a very impressive number and will finally resume, when we finally resume school, and they will be mentally and physically ready to resume the curriculum. Thank you. I want to turn it back to my colleague, Caitlin.
Thanks very much, Abba. That was great. Next slide, please. So in terms of the considerations for the return to learning, here I'll share how both the Ministry of Education in Liberia and how Luminos are approaching this. First, with respect to what the ministry is doing to support government school students to catch up. Grades 6 through 12 are returning to school this summer in phases, starting with grade 12 last month to prepare for national exams, which will be held in late August. Catch-up classes are being held for 1 to 2 months between August and November prior to the new academic year with a focus on core subjects. For ECE through grade 5, they won't be attending catch-up classes or finish the 2019-20 academic year. They'll return to school in October for the start of the new school year. Between now and then, the government is urging schools to package lessons for students to work on from home. They're also putting together learning packs, which will be distributed. In terms of what we're thinking at Luminos and the considerations that we're currently navigating with respect to catching learners up, and just to be clear, these are learners that were in the Second Chance program last year. So they're AE learners in a 10-month accelerated learning program, and they've missed 1/3 or 3 months of their 10-month AEP. There are 2 options that we're currently considering for these learners. The first is holding classes over the summer months to get learners back on track. This may look similar to a catch-up program like what Kayla was describing in her really helpful overview of the decision tree. It would involve condensing the final third of the Second Chance curriculum. And these would be full school days. They would require contracting Luminos teachers to work over the summer. This would also require Luminos gaining permission from the ministry to operate over the summer. And as I just mentioned, the government, again, isn't planning for the lower grades to go back to school until the new academic year in October. The second option we're considering is extending instructional time for learners during evening and over the weekends. This would be in October once the new academic year begins. These learners likely wouldn't cover much, if any, of the content they missed last spring. It would be mostly reviewing what they learned last year and just ensuring learning. There are a couple of challenges with this option, as you might guess. On the learner side, these are learners, again, that would have just transitioned into the formal school system, and so they would be juggling their Luminos catch-up classes on the side of attending government school during the day. On the teacher side, we have a set number of teachers at Luminos who are trained in the Second Chance pedagogy. And we'd be deploying these teachers essentially across two cohorts of students, last year's students for the catch-up classes, and also the new cohort of students that start with us in the fall. And third, based on the latest guidance from the ministry, government school classes in the fall may include instructional time on the weekends. And Luminos, of course, would need to work around the government school timetable. Obviously, we can't hold classes during government school hours for learners that recently transitioned. If we think back to the decision tree, both of these options have learners returning to the same accelerated learning program. The first option looks similar to a catch-up program, and the second option, again, is extended instructional time for AE learners. A few questions that we're currently still grappling with at Luminos. The first is, as Kayla pointed out, it's so important that our learners are promoted and that they transition to government school as planned when the new academic year starts in October. These learners need to stay on track with learners in the formal system. We don't, for instance, want to hold them back and have them repeat their AEP. And second, is, to Kayla's great point, both of these options, with both of these options, we're faced with the question of if and how you further accelerate an accelerated learning program, which we can get into a little bit more on the next slide. Just a quick note on our donors and their response to the options I've just shared. Our donors have been very open and flexible through the school closures and have been really open to new approaches and ideas that we've brought to the table, which has been immensely helpful as we navigate the uncertainty that this period has brought. Next slide. And in terms of our plans for school reopening, as most people on this call are aware, there's a lot of fluidity and ambiguity at the moment. Our plans at Luminos are still very much in flux. What I'll share now is our best guess happen based on the current information that we have, but it's very possible that it all changes as well. So we have two cohorts of students that we're currently planning for. The first on the left are students who were with us in Second Chance last school year. So for these learners, we've been in touch with the ministry through this entire period regarding the possibility of opening school early. We continue to be in dialogue with the ministry on this. At this stage, we aim to resume classes in August, spend August and September catching learners up before the start of the new academic year. If we go back to the decision tree, again, this would look similar to a catch-up program. We'd aim to cover the remaining third of the Second Chance curriculum that learners missed last spring. However, there's the possibility that we aren't able to open school early, in which case we'll aim to extend instructional time for these learners in the fall. So in contrast to the catch-up program, which would take place over the summer, the focus here would be on understanding the learning loss that has taken place during school closures and reviewing content from last year versus cramming the new content in. With either scenario, with both of these scenarios, our students will transition as planned again to the formal system for the new academic year in October. And then on the right side here, we have the new Luminos cohort. So these are students that were out of school last spring during the school closures. They'll be starting Second Chance with us in October. A few of the things that we're planning for with respect to this cohort include new social and emotional learning elements that we might add to the curriculum. These will support learners' broader needs as a result of the pandemic. We're also thinking through how we can further support no-tech home-based learning in the case of extended school closures through the fall. For instance, we're putting together a curriculum-aligned workbook, which should further support distance learning at home. Training for our teachers may take place in multiple smaller batches as opposed to one large training. For both of these cohorts of students, we'll be closely following and adhering to government guidelines with respect to wash and health and physical distancing. And just to close, we'll just say that, like many of you on this call, at Luminos, our #1 priority is ensuring that learners, teachers, and staff stay safe through COVID. So at the same time, while we're eager to resume learning as quickly as possible, again, safety is our #1 concern. Thanks so very much.
Thanks so much to the Luminos team and to all our presenters today. Fascinating hearing from all of you. We know this is a complex and challenging issue, so we really appreciate it, how you're navigating it at this time. I really appreciated as well hearing, different contexts, a mix of sort of the national policy response and then the detailed program response, as well as all of the interagency collaboration that you've been leading, Martha, and the tools that have become available for the EIE community. So thanks to all the panelists. We've also had some brilliant questions, fascinating questions coming in the Q&A. So thank you to all the participants. And we now do have a good 25 minutes together to explore those questions. So I'm going to ask all our panelists to put their videos back on and to join us for this discussion. So Kayla and Nasima and others, please do come back on so we can have a good discussion now. I'm also conscious that we've got participants joining via Facebook. You can also submit questions. Colleagues of mine are checking the Facebook comments, so we'll make sure we capture comments and questions there as well. But let's start off with a question that a few people have raised around accelerated education and how we can do accelerated education well, considering our ways of working during social distancing. So a few people have flagged that we use things like group work and the role the teacher plays facilitating learners. How can we do that well? Are there any pedagogical strategies, for examples, that we could be using at this time? So I'll open that up to all of our panelists. Can anyone jump in, just recognizing these social distancing conditions we're working in?
I can have a go. I think I think it's very, very difficult. I know that's not a very helpful answer, but I think there's no kind of golden bullet. I think a lot of the pedagogy that we encourage in all of our education now, but particularly in accelerated education, is very student-centered, and as you mentioned, Charlotte, encourages a lot of group work and a lot of, I guess, participation. And of course, that's going to be very limited or look much different in the classroom. I guess one thing teachers can do is this potential of double shifting or just having less students in the classroom and trying to work in as much as possible, I guess, exploiting those student-centered pedagogy in the classroom whilst trying to maintain some kind of social distancing. But I think it's an excellent question. I don't really have a better answer than that. I don't know, potentially if colleagues, maybe Caitlin, Kayla or Raphael, if you have any thoughts on that. But it's a really good question, and I think it's a really difficult time for teachers, and they have to really kind of think how they can maintain that participation and that facilitation and all those games and things that we encourage whilst trying to maintain that social distance. Just very, very difficult.
Thanks, Martha. Kayla, yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Martha. It's really sort of it's the golden question. There's no golden answer. A couple of things that I'm finding really interesting that I'm hearing a lot about is the idea of creating cohorts within classrooms and trying to keep those cohorts interacting only amongst themselves. So a group of 5 to 6 kids within a class are always working together. Now, I don't know how close they're sitting, if they're crossing that 6-foot distance in order to do group work. And if they are, I don't know if that's a safe choice or not. So I'm not arguing that this is a good option. I'm just saying it's potentially interesting to me. And one thing that's interesting is the opportunity to allow groups of learners to be together in sort of their small bubble and keeping that bubble away from other bubbles. I was recently listening to a news report where they were sort of describing this process where if somebody was sick in that bubble, then the amount of spread is confined. And so that to me is potentially interesting. Again, I'm not advocating for it. I'm not a health expert. The other thing I was wondering if it would be possible is exploring different ways to, I think one part of learner-centered pedagogy can be drawing on learners' experiences outside of the classroom. So we know that most learners are going home to family groups. So I wonder if there's any sort of more learner-centered activities that can be done in the home, a little project to go home and carry out, with their siblings. So those are some of the things that I was thinking of, totally spitballing. We don't have the evidence for this. I think it's an essential time to gather the evidence and gather stories of what appears to be working well, because it's a really, innovative situation to figure out different ways to do learner-centered pedagogy. I don't want to call Caitlin out, but I'm super curious to hear what Luminos is thinking, because I know your pedagogy is already very learner-centered, and I'm wondering how you're coping with it.
Yeah, happy to chime in briefly here. Thanks, Kayla. So through the school closure period, we have been holding small classes or small groups of students have been gathering with facilitators. A lot of our facilitators or teachers are based in the communities in which we work. And so it's really supported small group instruction through the school closure period. I think we're very much still learning in terms of integrating activity-based learning into this new format, and we'll be learning through the fall.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Like you say, we're all learning, and I think the more we can share these ideas and examples, the better. So I'd encourage any participants and attendees, if you've seen any good practice, please do share it in the chat. And perhaps those of us at INEE and the Accelerated Education Working Group can keep looking out for those case studies and examples and keep sharing them with each other. This leads us quite nicely to a second question, though. It's come up a bit, recognizing the potentially additional burden on teachers. Not just in terms of the pedagogy, although that's key, but also additional time perhaps in the classroom, additional roles they're playing now in terms of looking after their students' health and well-being, and even more than in normal circumstances. We know that some teachers' pay, etc., is under threat. Double shifting potentially has implications for teachers. So just recognizing the implications for teachers. And we've been asked particularly, have you seen any good practice for support for teachers and training for teachers around accelerated education at this time? So anything that you've seen in particularly support for teachers that you think is good practice?
I would like just to maybe ask Rafael from the ministry in Mozambique, because he was talking very importantly about something that I hadn't really thought of, is how when they're talking about the phased return, as well as sort of candidate classes, also talking about the importance of teacher trainers who are about to graduate. And Rafael, I think that you were talking about some specific training for those teachers on the condensed curriculum. Is that correct?
Oh, let's just unmute, make sure you're on mute so we hear the this great answer. There we go. Oh, perfect.
Yeah. Yes, I was talking about teachers who are in training. They must finish their training before the starting of next year, because we need them to go to school and teach. Every year, we need more than 10,000 new teachers to go to school. So if you are not graduating this year, we will have this gap next year. So, but these people in schools, or these teachers in schools, they need such a kind of training to deal with these new programs, new syllabus that have been condensed, so that they can learn how to accelerate the teaching. They divide this process in two parts. They have contact lessons where they speak with their children or their pupils and teach the basics of the content. And then the second part, they give the homework where the pupils work alone at home with the support of the parents or friends, and they develop this knowledge, the skills they need to develop to be evaluated by the end of the year. Sorry about my English, but I want to I want to tell you that we have this learning and teaching process divided into two parts. The first part is the contact lessons, where pupils go to the classroom and work with the teacher. After that, there's a second part where the teachers give them the homework to develop the skills, what they need to be evaluated by the end of the year. So we solve this tension between the finishing the curriculum and gaining the competencies.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Yeah, really interesting there as well, thinking about how we can leverage working with, you know, teacher training, colleges and universities, and supporting teachers in their training at the moment so that they're prepared to face this new reality in the new school year. So yeah, great example there. Any other examples of support to teachers, perhaps from the Liberia example? Abba, did you want to come in?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much. Training has been very difficult all around, simply for the fact that we can't gather in large numbers. And for the Luminous contest, we are very used to training all our facilitators together. But now with COVID, one of the things that we've done, we've tried the remote training, which is through telephones, calling all the facilitators through conference calls to be able to train them on the worksheets that are going out, and also train them on some COVID-19 precautions so that when they go out, they know all the safety measures and know how to interact with the children. It's a blessing for us to have most of our facilitators are still in their communities. So these trainings, when we reach out to them, they are easy to be able to apply them in the community. Another blessing for us is that we still have all of our teachers on payroll. So it's easier to reach out to them on these conference calls and be able to spread out these messages. So the remote training has been something that we've taken advantage of. When we finally reopen, whenever the ministry have given us permission, we'd like to do a couple more trainings, refresher trainings, so that teachers are prepared to get now. And one of the things I've come up is, oh, can you guys hear me?
The connection's a little bit weak, but we can hear you better now.
Okay, can you hear me now? Good. So when we reopen the refresher trainings, we're thinking about smaller groups of training, if not conference calls. We're just going to break our facilitators up in smaller groups and do a series of training to ensure that we're able to reach every single one of them for the reopening of school.
Great, thank you so much. So really interesting, I think, hearing there from our Mozambique colleagues about how we add in these competencies and content for teachers relevant to the response at the moment. And then from Liberia, thinking about these different modalities for supporting teachers, and both pieces feel so important. And also recognizing that condensed curriculums, that's a challenge in itself for teachers, and thinking about how we equip them with that in normal circumstances, let alone in these challenging settings. So appreciate sharing lessons learned there. We do have many questions. I could so much to discuss on teachers, but just to jump to another question, and Kayla, I might start this one with you, if that's okay. I had a question about measuring learning lost. And I just wondered if from your research already, if you've seen good examples of how we can identify learning lost as a result of school shutdowns, if there are any valid and rapidly implementable ways of measuring this. So maybe start with Kayla, but if anyone else wants to jump in, please do.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. Unfortunately, I haven't yet seen a validated tool. That's not to say that they don't exist. I haven't come across one yet. I'll be very curious to hear if others are developing or have developed their own tools, to just sort of post in the chat and tell us a little bit about it, especially if you have links. Well, first of all, just a bit more background on the concept of how much education is lost or learning lost in the decision tree. When we were sort of conceptualizing this, it was a bit more, we recognized that there are so many factors that contribute to learning loss. And it's not just the amount of time that learners are out of school, but that's one factor, of course. But it's also their access to distance learning when they're out of school, as well as the quality of that distance learning, as well as myriad other individual, family, school, and community factors that sort of indicate how much learning is lost. So it's just such a complex topic. One area that I've been beginning to explore and am intending to explore in my work in the coming weeks is looking at summer learning loss. And oh, right. Yeah, thanks, Nina. I remember reading that one. That one is really helpful that Nina just posted in the chat box about learning loss in Pakistan after a natural disaster. But another one that I recently found, and I'm going to post in just a bit, is an interesting study on what summer learning loss can tell us about COVID-19. And so we can think about different ways of thinking about learning loss. So if schools are closing, usually, you know, learning is increasing at a specified rate, which depends on the type of content being learned, the age of the student, and many, many other factors. But when schools effectively closed, learning could either be lost and going downhill, it could be being maintained, but it's really not increasing at this point. So this particular study seemed to be very interesting in thinking about what learning loss might look like, and I've just posted it there, that we know based on summer learning loss. So I encourage folks to continue to share what tools or research people have come across. Yeah, and I just appreciate the question because it's something that we're all really grappling with right now.
Thanks, Kayla. I don't know if others have seen other tools and they'd like to jump in. Please do come off mic if you'd add anything. As you say, I think it's, again, an area where we're learning and keen to hear from our participants as well if they have any suggestions. Caitlin, yes, please.
Just super briefly, at Luminos, we are planning to do a diagnostic test with students when they come back to school. We'll be comparing this with results that they had completed just before the school closures in March, when we had done like a midline. On top of this, we do weekly formative assessments individually with students. This is basically like a words per minute test to kind of gauge their reading level. This is our current thinking. Of course, things might change a little bit, but this is what we're currently planning.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thank you so much. And as ever, keen to keep it. We'll keep trying to collect these case studies and examples. And if anyone's listening, we are also running a blog series to share examples. So we'll pick up some of these key issues and perhaps try and share more examples via the blog series as well. Let's move to another question now. Another question about what can we do to specifically reach more vulnerable children. I know you mentioned this briefly, Kyla, in the presentation around the other barriers beyond COVID-19 that many children and young people face that prevent them accessing education. So just keen to hear, I think, how in perhaps Mozambique and Liberia, any activities to reach the more vulnerable children at this time who may not know about these different opportunities that are available. So I don't know if we can come to you first, Rafael, and from Mozambique, how are you reaching the most vulnerable learners? I should also say that your English is very clear. We're very grateful that you've been joining in English today.
Thank you. We are working with the partners to help these vulnerable children, giving handouts. We said before that some schools have difficulties to print out the handouts to give the children. So sometimes the parents don't have enough money to pay these handouts. So we have NGOs who work with the Ministry of Education to print out these handouts to help and to distribute and help these children. Sometimes we have
also distance education.
Distance education run by NGOs. No. With support of the Ministry of Education, but who design and give is an organization in the Ministry of Education, but this organization has support from the partners to give this distance education.
Printing learning materials.
They print learning materials, they work in radio and television.
Great, thank you so much, Rafael. So I think, you know, again, it highlights the importance of that collaboration, close collaboration amongst all of us at this time. And as well as, yeah, thinking about not just the technology as a solutions, but these lower tech options as well. Thank you so much. Anyone else just on that question of reaching the most vulnerable? I know it's very important to the INEE members, it's a question that comes up a lot. Abba, I see you've come off mute, do jump in.
Thank you so much. At Luminous, we work out of the most vulnerable communities in Liberia, and our objective is to reach probably the most vulnerable children that we are able to meet. Recruitments for these kids are done by the IPs that we work with, the implementing partners, and we have a very strict criteria that we've set to ensure that we are getting the most vulnerable kids on our program. Every year, the program is expanding and reaching more kids, but the criteria is very important because we're realizing that some people who are able to send their kids to school, who can afford, are still trying to slide in this program because this is such a intensive phonics program that ensure that kids are reading, and a lot of people would like to benefit from that. So we have found out in the past that we have recruited some kids who are probably less vulnerable than most. So the criteria is very strict nowadays, and we work with the partners to ensure that we reach the most vulnerable kids. And for the fact that we are targeting kids who are over age and never been to school before, makes that a little easier for us. Because if kids are not too vulnerable, I don't think they will be in that category. So for the fact that we're running such a program, it's easier for us to reach these kids. But at times we realize there are people who are still sliding in, who are probably more able to go to school than other kids. So we want to tighten up our criteria, and we have the Luminous supervisors are out in the field to ensure that these recruitments are going exactly by these criteria.
Great, thanks, Abba. And I think it's that reflection that there's existing emergencies with COVID, and then potentially there's additional implications of COVID, increasing those barriers. So yeah, great to hear these examples of how we can reach these most vulnerable young people. I'm really conscious of time. Kayla, did you want to come in quickly there? And then we'll just have one more question.
Yeah, absolutely. So when exploring some of these ways to be sure that we're involving the most marginalized learners in developing the brief and the decision tree, a couple of things that we were looking at is, looking back at the more general education emergencies literature, and I think there's quite a lot out there in terms of evidence-based practices that can increase involvement of marginalized groups, which we hope will be helpful during this time. So some of those things might be using cash transfers, eliminating school fees, providing school materials and uniforms that are needed. Also using back to school campaigns, not only to disseminate information, but as a way to provide those provide for those material needs. And another huge area that's going to be so important is around communication. So involving communities in order to understand their learners' needs in returning to school, but also in helping to build the trust that schools are going to be a safe place to send your kids back, and for kids to go back, and for teachers to go back. And so building that trust, particularly around the safety, as well as how to go back and what are other options if you're not quite ready to go back. So those are some of the things that we predict based on previous emergencies might be very helpful.
Thanks, Kayla. Great. We've had quite a few questions around condensing the curriculum, some around the science behind it, some around balancing content and competencies, others around existing evidence of the impact of condensing the curriculum, others asking about what we do for existing accelerated programs if we need to accelerate them. Martha, I just wondered if you could say a few words about the next webinar that we're planning, which will perhaps shed a bit more light on this.
Yes, so like I mentioned in the very beginning, we have developed 3 tools. So the 2 tools that Kayla went through today, the brief and the accelerated or the COVID decision tree, but also we have this 3rd tool. It's an 8-page document, and it talks about, it's a really basic guide. It's very practical on how to condense a curriculum, like the basic steps and what you should do. And I think it's a really, we try to make it you know, it's technical, but it's hopefully simple enough to use in a multitude of situations by a multitude of stakeholders. And we've really been working on that with a task team from the Accelerated Education Working Group and a curriculum expert who's been doing that, as well as the Accelerated Education Group more widely. And we're going to be having a webinar that in the last week of August. I think it's on the 28th of August, but I'm not quite sure about that date, but definitely the last week of August. And I think that's really brought up some really key considerations for us. You know, exactly the kind of questions that I think I can see in the chat. You know, do we focus on competencies and this tension between finishing the curriculum and getting through the competencies? What do we condense? You know, taking out repetition, focusing on basic literacy and numeracy, but then also kind of teaching towards the exam. So we've really gone through a lot of rounds of kind of revision, and I think it's a really interesting document. And actually it will be ready, it'll be in the webinar the last week of August, but actually it will be hopefully up on the INEE site well before that, probably early next week. So people can look through it. It will be great for people to look over it before we have the webinar. I know, Kayla, you were very involved in that. So if you wanted to add anything.
I don't have anything to add. I mean, I think the best person to go to for tips and tricks are to speak with the consultant on that, who will be presenting on the webinar. But you know, I think all of the questions that were raised around condensing curriculum are really important, and this is going to be an opportune time to gather a lot of data on how it works and what our best practices in doing that. So I look forward to that.
Well, I'm very sorry to say that we're at time. It's been such a rich discussion. I wish we could continue for longer, but I just want to say a huge thank you to all of the participants who joined us today, and of course our brilliant panelists for sharing their experiences, tools and resources with us. We will share details of the Part 2 webinar at the end of August with you very soon, and all of the tools and resources mentioned today are available on the INEE website. But I'm conscious we're at time, so we will close there. But thank you everyone for joining us. Very much keeping in mind your messages, Kayla, about thinking about what we can do in the immediate term, but also really thinking about how we plan to build back more resilient and stronger systems that reach more children and young people in the future. So definitely taking that with us as we close this webinar today. Thanks everybody, stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Best wishes.
Thank you.